Welcome back to HOA Rulebook. The board called it compliance, and I called it extortion. Karen barked that my sidewalk was not passable because of snowdrift and she was writing a violation and scheduling a reinspection fee. Your sidewalk looks like a lawsuit and I am not letting it happen. Her voice cut through the cold air like a blade. I stood on my front step in Elk Grove, California, holding a salt scoop and a small bucket, staring at the woman who had just accused me of creating a public hazard. Snow was piled in uneven ridges along the curb where the city plow had shoved it hours earlier. My sidewalk was clear. I had shoveled it twice already that morning. Karen Baker, treasurer of the Iron Gate Winter District HOA, stood in the middle of my driveway with a phone in one hand and a small notepad with wet pages in the other. She was wearing a blue puffer coat with the hood up and a blue knit beanie underneath. Her black hair was pulled back in a low bun, a stack of orange cones strapped together with a clip hung from her other arm like a weapon. "Your sidewalk looks like a lawsuit and I am not letting it happen," she said again, louder this time. "I install security systems for a living. I understand cameras and I understand privacy laws. I also understand when someone is lying to my face. The sidewalk was passable. There was no drift blocking it. The only snow on my property was the pile the city plow had left at the curb, and that was city responsibility, not mine." I told her that. She did not care. She tapped her phone screen and said she was documenting the violation. She said the HOA had emergency winter rules and I was in breach. She said the reinspection fee was $250 and it would be billed to my account by end of day. I asked her to show me the rule. She said, "This conversation is not a debate. It is a directive." Then she turned and walked back toward her car, which was parked in the street with the hazards flashing. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. The snow was still falling lightly. The sky was gray. The temperature was somewhere in the low 20s. I had moved to this neighborhood 6 months earlier, right after a rough breakup and a job transfer that forced me to relocate fast. I was rebuilding after a move and I could not take more disruption. The last thing I needed was an HOA war over snow. But Karen had just declared one. I went back inside and pulled up the HOA portal on my laptop. The emergency winter rules were buried in a PDF dated 3 weeks earlier. The language was vague. It said residents were responsible for maintaining passable sidewalks during snow events and that the HOA could conduct inspections and levy fines for non-compliance. It did not define passable. It did not say how much snow was too much. It did not mention reinspection fees. I took screenshots. Then I grabbed my phone and went back outside. I recorded a slow pan of the entire sidewalk, the cleared path from the street to my front door, and the snow pile at the curb. I also recorded the city plow tracks in the street and the fact that every other house on the block had the same curb pile. Then I sent an email to the HOA management company with the video attached and a polite request for clarification on the violation. The reply came back in under an hour. The management company said the HOA board had delegated all winter compliance authority to the treasurer and that I should direct all questions to Karen Baker. They included her email address. I already had it. I sent her a message. I attached the video. I asked her to explain which part of my sidewalk was not passable. I asked her to cite the specific rule I had violated. I asked her to explain the reinspection fee, which was not mentioned anywhere in the emergency rules document. She did not reply. 2 hours later, I got a formal violation notice in my HOA portal. The notice said I had failed to maintain a passable sidewalk and that the violation was documented with photographic evidence. It said the fine was $100 and the reinspection fee was $250. It said I had 72 hours to cure the violation or the fines would double. It said if I did not cure within 72 hours, the HOA would revoke my parking pass and I would not be allowed to park in any common area lot until the violation was resolved. That last part hit hard. The HOA threatens to revoke my parking pass right before an overnight storm. The weather forecast was calling for another 6 inches overnight and a flash freeze. If I lost my parking pass, I would have to park on the street, which meant my car would get plowed in and possibly towed by the city. I called the management company again. They told me the same thing. All Winter Compliance Authority was with the treasurer. If I wanted to dispute the fine, I could request a hearing, but the hearing would not happen until after the 72-hour cure window closed. I asked if I could speak to the board president. They said the president had recused himself from all winter enforcement matters because of a conflict of interest. They would not tell me what the conflict was. I swallowed my anger, because I knew the moment to use it was coming. I went back outside and shoveled the sidewalk again, even though it did not need it. I cleared the curb pile as much as I could without stepping into the street and blocking traffic. I salted everything. I took more video. I timestamped it. Then I printed a copy of the violation notice, the emergency rules PDF, and my email exchange with the management company. I put everything in a folder. I also printed a copy of the California Open Meeting Act because I had a feeling I was going to need it. That night, the snow came down hard. By morning, the sidewalk was buried under 4 inches of fresh powder. I got up at 6 and shoveled again. I cleared a path 3 feet wide, which was wider than the rule required. I salted it. I took more video. By 8, Karen was back. She pulled up in her car, got out with her phone and her notepad, and started filming my sidewalk. I walked outside. She did not say hello. She said, "You are not the first person I have corrected, and you will not be the last." She said my sidewalk was still not compliant because the snow had drifted back overnight and the path was not maintained continuously. I told her I had just shoveled it 20 minutes earlier. She said that did not matter. She said the rule required continuous maintenance during active snow events. I asked her to show me where the rule said that. She said, "This conversation is not a debate, it is a directive." Then she took more photos and walked back to her car. I followed her. I asked her if she was inspecting every house on the block or just mine. She did not answer. I asked her if she had inspected her own sidewalk. She told me to step back or she would call the police for harassment. She drove off. I went back inside and checked the HOA portal. Another violation notice was already posted. Same fine. Same reinspection fee. Same 72-hour cure window. This time the notice included a new line. It said repeated violations could result in a lien on my property. I sat down and did the math. 2 fines at $100 each. 2 reinspection fees at $250 each. That was $700 in 2 days. If she kept this up, I would be broke by the end of the week. I needed help. I called my neighbor, the guy who lived 2 doors down. His name was Mike. He was retired, friendly, and he hated the HOA. He had told me stories about the board manipulating minutes and agendas to erase objections after the meeting. He had tried to run for the board once and lost because Karen had challenged his eligibility at the last minute, and the board had sided with her. When I told him what was happening, he laughed. Not a happy laugh. A bitter one. He said Karen had tried the same thing with him last winter. She had accused him of letting ice build up on his driveway and threatened to fine him. He had fought it and won, but only because he had hired a lawyer and the lawyer had threatened to sue the HOA for selective enforcement. He said the board had backed down fast after that. He also said Karen had a reputation for targeting people she did not like and making up rules as she went. He said the emergency winter rules were new this year and nobody had voted on them. The board had passed them in a closed session without notice. He said that was illegal under the Open Meeting Act, but nobody had challenged it yet. He told me to document everything and to show up at the next board meeting with evidence. He said he would come with me. I thanked him and hung up. Then I started digging. I pulled every HOA meeting minute from the past 2 years. I found the emergency rules adoption buried in a special meeting notice from December. The notice had been posted on the HOA website with less than 24 hours of warning. The meeting had been held on a weekday afternoon when most residents were at work. Only 3 board members had attended. Karen had been one of them. The minutes said the rules were adopted unanimously. There was no mention of public comment. There was no mention of a vote count. I printed everything. Then I checked the HOA bylaws. The bylaws said all rule changes required a notice period of at least 10 days and a vote at a regular meeting with a quorum present. The emergency rules had been adopted in violation of the bylaws. That meant they were not valid. I had my first piece of evidence. But I needed more. I needed to prove selective enforcement. I needed to prove Karen was targeting me. And I needed to do it before she revoked my parking pass and towed my car. The next morning, I got up early and walked the entire neighborhood. I took photos of every sidewalk on every street. Most of them were not cleared. Some had snow piles 2 feet high. A few had ice patches that were genuinely dangerous. None of them had violation notices posted. I also checked the HOA portal. No other residents had fines listed. Just me. I sent all the photos to Mike. He sent back a text that said, "Got it. This is gold. Keep going." That afternoon, Karen showed up again. This time, she was not alone. She had 2 people with her. Both were wearing bright yellow reflective vests and carrying clipboards. One was a middle-aged man with gray hair and a red windbreaker. The other was a younger woman with blonde hair and a green coat. They looked official. They looked like they had authority. Karen introduced them as HOA compliance volunteers. She said they were conducting a neighborhood-wide sidewalk audit and that my property was first on the list. I asked her why my property was first. She said it was alphabetical. I told her my last name did not start with A. She ignored me. The 2 volunteers walked up to my sidewalk with a tape measure. They measured the width of the cleared path. They measured the depth of the snow on either side. They took notes. They did not speak to me. Karen stood behind them with her phone, filming the whole thing. I asked her if she was filming me without my consent. She said she was filming the property, not me, and that I had no expectation of privacy in my front yard. She was right. I knew that. But it still felt like harassment. When the volunteers finished measuring, they walked back to Karen and handed her their clipboards. She looked at the notes and nodded. Then she turned to me and said my sidewalk was non-compliant because the cleared path was only 34 inches wide and the rule required 36 inches minimum. I asked her to show me where the rule said that. She held up one of the clipboards and pointed to a line of text. I could not read it from where I was standing. I stepped closer. She pulled the clipboard back and said I was not allowed to touch HOA documents. I asked her to read the line out loud. She refused. One of the volunteers, the man with gray hair, cleared his throat. He looked uncomfortable. I turned to him and asked him directly where the 36-inch rule was written. He glanced at Karen. She gave him a look that said, "Do not answer." He did not answer. I asked him if he had a copy of the emergency rules with him. He said no. I asked him how he was supposed to audit compliance if he did not have a copy of the rules. He did not answer. Karen stepped between us and said the audit was over and that I would receive an updated violation notice by end of day. She told the volunteers to move on to the next property. They did not move. The woman with blonde hair looked at me and said, "I think his sidewalk is fine." Karen turned to her, fast. She said, "Excuse me." The woman said, "I have been walking this neighborhood for 2 years and his sidewalk is one of the best. Most people have not shoveled at all." Karen told her to stay on task. The woman shook her head and said, "I am not writing this up." Then she handed her clipboard to Karen and walked back to her car. The man with gray hair hesitated. Then he did the same. Karen was left standing alone with 2 clipboards and a phone. Her face went red. She pointed at me and said, "You will regret this." Then she got in her car and drove off. I stood there for a minute, trying to process what had just happened. The volunteers had quit. They had seen through it. Karen had tried to stage a fake compliance squad and it had fallen apart under basic questions. I pulled out my phone and called Mike. I told him what happened. He laughed so hard I thought he was going to choke. He said, "That is the best thing I have heard all year." He also said, "You just made an enemy for life. Be ready." He was right. The next morning, I woke up to find a new notice in my HOA portal. This one was different. It said the HOA board had voted in an emergency session to suspend my access to all common amenities until my sidewalk violations were resolved. That meant no gym, no pool, no clubhouse, no guest parking. It also said my parking pass was revoked effective immediately, and that any vehicle parked in HOA lots without a valid pass would be towed at owner expense. The notice was signed by Karen Baker, treasurer, on behalf of the board. There was no meeting date listed. There was no vote tally. There was no mention of which board members had attended. I checked the HOA website. There was no notice of an emergency meeting. I called the management company. They said they had not been notified of any meeting. They said Karen had sent them the notice directly and told them to post it. They said if I wanted to challenge it, I needed to request a hearing. I told them I was requesting a hearing. They said the next available slot was in 3 weeks. I told them that was not acceptable. They said there was nothing they could do. I hung up and called Mike again. He said the board was violating the Open Meeting Act. He said emergency meetings required at least 24 hours notice unless there was a genuine emergency, and a sidewalk dispute was not an emergency. He said we needed to file a complaint with the county. He also said we needed to go to the next board meeting and confront them in person. The next meeting was in 5 days. I marked it on my calendar. Then I went outside to check my car. It was still parked in the HOA lot near my unit. I did not have anywhere else to park it. The street was full and the city had posted no parking signs on both sides because of the snow emergency. If the HOA towed me, I was screwed. I decided to move fast. I called a tow company and asked them if they had a contract with the Iron Gate Winter District HOA. The dispatcher said yes. I asked them how many calls they had received from the HOA in the past month. She said she could not give me that information. I asked her if she could confirm whether a specific vehicle had been towed recently. She said no. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called another tow company. Same questions. Same answers. On the third call, I got lucky. The dispatcher was a guy named Carlos. He sounded tired. When I mentioned the HOA, he groaned. He said, "Let me guess. Karen Baker." I said yes. He said, "Yeah. She calls us all the time. Half the time, the tows are not even legal. We have been trying to get out of the contract, but she keeps threatening to sue." I asked him if he could give me records of recent tow requests. He said he could not give me records, but he could tell me off the record that the HOA had requested 6 tows in the past 2 weeks, and 4 of them had been canceled because the vehicles were legally parked. He also said one of the tows had been for my address. I asked him when. He said yesterday. I asked him why it was canceled. He said the driver had arrived and seen that the vehicle had a valid parking pass displayed and was parked in an assigned spot. He said the driver had called the office and they had told Karen the tow was not authorized. He said Karen had argued with them for 10 minutes and then hung up. I thanked Carlos and told him I owed him a beer. He said, "Just get that woman off our backs." If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more HOA horror stories that will make you question everything. I had my second piece of evidence. Karen had tried to tow my car illegally. That was a crime. It was also proof of harassment. I called Mike and told him. He said, "Now we are cooking." He also said, "You need to record everything from here on out." Every interaction, every email, every phone call. If she shows up at your door, record it. If she calls you, record it. Do not give her a chance to lie. I told him I was already doing that. He said, good. Now let me make a call. He hung up. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. It was a number I did not recognize. I answered. The voice on the other end said, "Hi, this is Deputy Collins with the county sheriff. I understand you might need some help with an HOA dispute." I told him yes. He said Mike had given him my number and explained the situation. He said he could not get involved in civil matters, but he could give me advice. He said if the HOA was violating the Open Meeting Act, I should file a formal complaint with the county clerk. He also said if Karen was harassing me or threatening illegal tows, I should document it and consider filing a police report. He said the sheriff department had dealt with the Iron Gate Winter District HOA before, and they had a reputation for overreach. He said most of their actions did not hold up under scrutiny. He also said the substation had a public mediation room and that if I wanted to schedule a meeting with the HOA board in a neutral location, they could provide space. He gave me his direct number and told me to call if things escalated. I thanked him. Then I sat down and started writing. I wrote a formal complaint to the county clerk detailing the Open Meeting Act violations. I attached copies of the meeting minutes, the emergency rules, and the bylaws. I wrote a separate complaint to the management company detailing the illegal tow attempt, the selective enforcement, and the lack of due process. I attached photos, videos, and the email record. Then I wrote a letter to the HOA board president. I kept it polite but firm. I said I was requesting an emergency hearing to address the violations and the harassment. I said if the hearing was not scheduled within 72 hours, I would file a lawsuit. I sent everything by certified mail. Then I waited. The next 2 days were quiet. Too quiet. Karen did not show up. No new violation notices appeared in the portal. No emails. No calls. I kept shoveling my sidewalk every morning. I kept taking video. I kept salting. The weather forecast said the snow was going to stop by the weekend and temperatures would rise into the 40s. If I could hold out until then, the whole dispute might fade. But I knew it would not. Karen was not the type to let go. On the third day, I got a call from the management company. They said the board president had agreed to schedule a hearing. The hearing would take place at the sheriff's substation in the public mediation room. The date was set for the following Tuesday at 6 in the evening. They said I could bring witnesses and evidence. They said the board would be represented by Karen Baker and one other board member. They did not say who. I called Mike. He said he would be there. I also called Carlos, the tow truck dispatcher. I asked him if he could attend and testify about the illegal tow requests. He hesitated. Then he said, "Yeah, I will be there." I think it is time someone called her out. I spent the next 4 days preparing. I printed every document. I organized everything into a binder with tabs. I made copies for everyone who would be at the hearing. I also made a timeline showing every interaction, every violation notice, every fine, and every attempt to escalate. I highlighted the Open Meeting Act violations in yellow. I highlighted the selective enforcement in green. I highlighted the illegal tow attempt in red. The binder was 2 inches thick by the time I was done. On Monday night, I went outside to shovel one last time before the hearing. The snow had finally stopped. The streets were clear. The temperature was rising. My sidewalk looked perfect. As I was finishing, a car pulled up. It was not Karen. It was a man I had never seen before. He got out and walked toward me. He was wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase. He said, "Are you the homeowner?" I said yes. He said, "I am here on behalf of the Iron Gate Winter District HOA. I have been authorized to offer you a settlement." I asked him what kind of settlement. He said the board was willing to waive all fines and fees if I agreed to drop the complaint and sign a non-disclosure agreement. He handed me a piece of paper. I read it. The NDA said I could not discuss the dispute with anyone, could not post about it online, and could not pursue any legal action. In exchange, the HOA would waive $700 in fines and fees. I handed the paper back to him. I said, no. He said, I would encourage you to reconsider. This is a generous offer. I said, I will see you at the hearing. He shrugged, got back in his car, and drove off. The hearing was set for 6. I arrived at 5:45. The sheriff's substation was a low brick building on the edge of town. The mediation room was in the back, past the front desk and down a hallway. It was a small conference room with a long table, 8 chairs, and a whiteboard on one wall. Mike was already there. He had brought his own binder. Carlos arrived a few minutes later. He looked nervous. I thanked him for coming. At 6, the door opened and Karen walked in. She was wearing the same blue puffer coat. Her hair was pulled back in the same low bun. She was carrying a phone with a cracked screen and a stack of orange cones strapped together with a clip. Behind her was another woman, older, with white hair and glasses. She introduced herself as the board secretary. No one else came. The board president did not show. Neither did the guy in the suit. Deputy Collins stepped into the room and said he would be observing to make sure things stayed civil. He sat in a chair by the door. Karen sat down across from me. She set her phone on the table, screen up, recording. I did the same. Mike sat to my left. Carlos sat to my right. The secretary sat next to Karen and opened a laptop. Karen started. She said, "This hearing is to address your repeated violations of HOA winter emergency rules and your refusal to comply with board directives." She said the board had documented multiple violations over a 2-week period and that my behavior had been disruptive and disrespectful to HOA volunteers. She said the fines and fees were appropriate and that the suspension of amenities was a necessary enforcement measure. She said if I did not agree to pay the fines and comply going forward, the board would move to place a lien on my property. Then she looked at me and said, "This conversation is not a debate, it is a directive." I opened my binder. I slid a copy across the table to her and one to the secretary. I said, "Let me start by addressing the emergency rules." I turned to the tab marked Open Meeting Act Violations. I said, "The emergency rules were adopted in a special meeting on December 14th with less than 24 hours notice. The meeting was held on a weekday afternoon. Only 3 board members attended. No public comment was allowed. According to your own bylaws, rule changes require at least 10 days' notice and a vote at a regular meeting with a quorum present. This adoption was illegal. The rules are not valid." Karen opened her mouth to respond. I kept going. I said, "Even if the rules were valid, you have enforced them selectively." I turned to the tab marked Selective Enforcement. I said, "I have photos of every sidewalk in this neighborhood. Most of them are not cleared. Some have snow piles 2 feet high. None of them have been fined. Only me. That is textbook selective enforcement and it is illegal under California law." Karen said, "Those properties are not in violation." I said, "Show me the rule that says my property is in violation and theirs are not." She did not answer. I turned to the tab marked Illegal Tow Attempt. I said, "On January 8th, you requested a tow for my vehicle even though it was legally parked in my assigned spot with a valid parking pass displayed. The tow company canceled the request because it was not authorized." I gestured to Carlos. I said, "The dispatcher is here to testify." Carlos nodded. He said, "That is correct. We canceled the tow because the vehicle was legally parked. Karen called us 3 more times that day trying to force it through. We refused. Karen's face went red. She said, That is not true. Carlos said, I have the dispatch log. I can provide it if needed. I said, I can also provide it. I have a copy. Karen stood up. She said, this is harassment. You are twisting the facts. You are trying to make me look bad. I said, I am presenting evidence. If the evidence makes you look bad, that is on you. Deputy Collins cleared his throat. He said, ma'am, please sit down. Karen sat. Her hands were shaking. The secretary looked uncomfortable. She was typing fast on the laptop, taking notes. I turned to the next tab. I said, let me also address the emergency meeting where you suspended my amenities and revoked my parking pass. I said, there was no public notice of that meeting. The management company was not notified. No other board members were present. You signed the notice yourself, on behalf of the board, without a vote. That is also a violation of the Open Meeting Act. Karen said, the board authorized me to act on their behalf. I said, show me the authorization in writing. She did not answer. I said, you cannot show me because it does not exist. You acted unilaterally, you abused your authority, and you did it to retaliate against me for questioning your enforcement. I paused. Then I said, I swallowed my anger, because I knew the moment to use it was coming. I reached into my bag and pulled out a second folder. I said, I also have this. I opened the folder. Inside was a printed copy of a tow company dispatch log that showed Karen had requested the tow without legal authority. I had gotten it from Carlos earlier that day. He had printed it off the record and handed it to me in the parking lot. I slid it across the table. I said, this is a dispatch log showing every tow request your HOA has made in the past 6 months. 4 of them were canceled because the vehicles were legally parked. 3 of them were for my vehicle. 1 of them was for another resident who filed a complaint and had the tow reversed. You have been using the tow company as a weapon to harass residents. That is illegal. It is also grounds for the tow company to terminate your contract, which I understand they are considering. Karen grabbed the log. Her hands were shaking harder now. She said, where did you get this? I said that is not relevant. What is relevant is that it is accurate. Carlos said, it is accurate. I printed it myself. Karen turned to him. She said, you are fired. Carlos laughed. He said, you cannot fire me. I do not work for you. I work for the tow company. And after tonight, the tow company is not working for you either. Karen's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Her face went pale. She stood up again. She said, this hearing is over. I said, no, it is not. Deputy Collins said, ma'am, sit down. If you leave now, this counts as a board failure to respond, and the complainant can escalate directly to the county. Karen sat. She looked at the secretary. The secretary was still typing. Karen said, stop typing. The secretary said, I am taking minutes. Karen said, I said stop. The secretary stopped. Then she looked at me and said, I think you should know that the board president resigned this morning. He sent an email saying he did not want to be involved in this dispute anymore. Karen tried to suppress the announcement, but I saw the email before the meeting. I opened my laptop and pulled up the email. The secretary had forwarded it to me an hour earlier. I turned the screen toward Deputy Collins. He read it and nodded. I said, so let me get this straight. The board president resigned because he did not want to be part of this. The other board members are not here. You are acting alone, without authority, and you are trying to enforce rules that were adopted illegally. Karen said nothing. I said, I am not here to negotiate. I am here to tell you that if you do not reverse every fine, every fee, and every suspension, I will file a lawsuit. I will also file a formal complaint with the State Attorney General for Open Meeting Act violations. And I will provide this dispatch log to every resident in this HOA so they know what you have been doing. Karen stood up one more time. She said, "You are not the first person I have corrected, and you will not be the last." I said, "That line is not going to age well. Because after tonight, you are done." She grabbed her phone and her cones and walked out. The secretary stayed. She looked at me and said, "I will make sure the minutes reflect everything that was said here. I will also recommend that the board reverse all actions taken against you." She closed her laptop and left. Deputy Collins stood up. He said that was something. He said, "For what it is worth, I think you handled that well. You kept it civil and you had your evidence ready. If she tries anything else, call me." I thanked him. Mike clapped me on the shoulder and said, "That was beautiful." Carlos said, "I am going to go call my boss and tell him to cancel the contract." We left the substation together. The parking lot was empty. Karen's car was gone. I sat in my car for a minute trying to process what had just happened. Then my phone rang. It was the management company. They said the board secretary had sent them a formal request to reverse all fines, fees, and suspensions related to my account. They said the request would be processed within 24 hours. They also said the board was scheduling an emergency meeting to address the Open Meeting Act violations, and that I would receive notice as required by law. I thanked them and hung up. The next morning, I checked my HOA portal. All the fines were gone. The parking pass was restored. The amenity suspension was lifted. There was a new notice posted. It said the emergency winter rules had been suspended pending a full board review and that all enforcement actions taken under those rules were being reversed. It also said the board treasurer had resigned effective immediately. I called Mike. I said, "Did you see it?" He said, "I saw it." I also saw the neighborhood group chat. Half the HOA is talking about it. Someone leaked the dispatch log. Karen is getting roasted. I asked him who leaked it. He said, "I do not know. But whoever did it is a hero." 2 days later, I got a letter in the mail. It was from the tow company. It said they had reviewed their contract with the Iron Gate Winter District HOA and decided to terminate it effective immediately. It said they were refunding all charges related to canceled tows, including the 3 attempts on my vehicle. The refund check was enclosed. It was for $275. The letter also said they were voiding my tow authorization, which meant the HOA could not request a tow on my vehicle without my permission. I framed the letter and hung it on my wall. The final board meeting happened 2 weeks later. It was held in the clubhouse at 7 in the evening. The room was packed. Every seat was full. People were standing along the walls. Mike was there. Carlos was there. The secretary was there. Karen was not. The board president who had resigned was also not there. The meeting was chaired by the vice president, a man named Tom who looked like he had not slept in days. He opened the meeting by reading a prepared statement. He said the board had conducted a review of the emergency winter rules and determined that they had been adopted in violation of the bylaws and the Open Meeting Act. He said the rules were void, and all enforcement actions taken under them were reversed. He said the HOA would refund all snow-related fines and fees paid by any resident. He also said the board had received multiple complaints about selective enforcement and harassment, and that they were taking those complaints seriously. Then, he said, "We owe you an apology." The room was silent. Then someone in the back started clapping. Then someone else. Then everyone. The applause lasted about 10 seconds. Then a man stood up and said, "What about Karen Baker?" Tom said, Miss Baker resigned from the board last week. She is no longer involved in HOA operations. The room erupted. People were shouting questions. Someone said, "Is she being investigated?" Tom said, "That is not something I can discuss, but I will say that we have referred certain matters to the county for review." Someone else said, "What about the tow company?" Tom said, "We have terminated our contract with the tow company and we are reviewing our enforcement policies to make sure this does not happen again." Then he opened the floor for public comment. I stood up. I said, "I want to thank everyone who supported me through this. I also want to say that this should never have happened. The emergency rules were illegal. The enforcement was illegal. The harassment was illegal. And it only stopped because I had the time, the resources, and the evidence to fight back. Not everyone has that. If this board is serious about reform, you need to make sure this never happens to anyone else." The room applauded again. Then Mike stood up. He said, "I have been in this neighborhood for 10 years. I have seen the board manipulate minutes and agendas to erase objections after the meeting. I have seen them target residents they do not like. I have seen them ignore the bylaws when it is convenient. This is not just about Karen Baker. This is about a culture of abuse that the board has enabled for years. If you want to fix it, you need to start by following your own rules." Tom nodded. He said, "Point taken. We will do better." The meeting ended at 9. I walked out with Mike and Carlos. Carlos said, "I am glad I showed up. That was worth it." Mike said, "You just changed this HOA forever. People are going to remember this." I said, "I hope so, because I do not want to go through it again." We stood in the parking lot for a few minutes talking about what happened. Then a car pulled up. It was Karen. She did not get out. She sat in the driver's seat with the engine running, staring at the clubhouse. Her face was blank. Then she drove off. I never saw her again. A few weeks later, I heard from a neighbor that she had sold her house and moved out of state. No one knew where she went. No one asked. The HOA held new board elections in March. Mike ran and won. He became the new treasurer. One of his first actions was to hire a city inspector to confirm what the HOA could and could not enforce when it came to snow removal. The inspector came out, walked the neighborhood, and issued a report. The report said the HOA had no authority to enforce sidewalk clearing because sidewalks were city property and the city had its own rules. The report also said the HOA could not fine residents for snow piles left by city plows because those piles were the city's responsibility, not the homeowners. The report was posted on the HOA website. Mike also rewrote the winter emergency rules to make them clear, enforceable, and legal. The new rules required a 10-day notice period, a public hearing, and a vote at a regular meeting. They also included a provision that said enforcement actions had to be applied equally to all residents, and that any resident who was fined had the right to a hearing within 7 days. The new rules passed unanimously. The HOA also refunded every snow-related fine and fee paid by any resident over the past 2 years. That included my $700. The check arrived in April. I deposited it and used it to buy a new snowblower. I figured I would need it next winter. I still live in the Iron Gate Winter District. The neighborhood is quieter now. The board follows the rules. Residents show up to meetings. People vote. The culture has changed. But I still shovel my sidewalk every time it snows. I still take video. I still keep records. Because I know how fast things can spiral when someone in power decides they do not like you. And I know that the only way to fight back is with evidence, patience, and the willingness to stand up when everyone else is looking the other way. Stay safe out there, and I will see you next time.